Thank you, Jonathan. It really helps if you write your own CV. Shalom. Thank you very much to Boaz and Jonathan for your hospitality here, and to Sir David Gerard, who couldn't be here, for inviting me to speak to you today. So it's very flattering to be in a room and to share a platform with such incredible counter-terrorism professionals. I feel a little bit like a schoolboy maths student telling a lot of astrophysicists how to land on the moon. It is incredibly flattering. I would not have thought that a small-town boy from England would have ended up addressing over 80 countries in a conference as prestigious as this. And accustomed as I am to public speaking, it always makes me nervous. You're quite an intimidating crowd. But despite my job and despite that nervousness, there's only one thing that really terrifies me, and that is overhead lighting. So I'm very pleased the podium is here, not over there. A few years ago, I was giving a press conference, and I made a beginner's error for my profession. I left my phone on, and my phone went off, and I made the second beginner's error by looking at the text message that I had been sent by my very appropriately named youngest son, Joshua, who said, "Dad, you're beginning to look like a giant talking Malteser." I always wonder whether that's going to translate, depending on where Mars sells its products. My name is Neil Basu. I lead the counter-terrorism response in London. I'm also the national lead for counter-terrorism on behalf of UK's chief constables. That means I effectively coordinate the budget, over £800 million, and many thousands of officers across the UK who effectively put in place the national police response to the government's counter-terrorism policy, which is called Contest. And the UK's counter-terrorism policy has four strategic pillars: pursue, to find and stop terrorists; protect, to identify and target harden our most important sites and people; prepare, ensure we can respond to and recover from an attack; and in my view, the most important pillar of the government strategy, prevent, to stop people become terrorists in the first place. It is why this speech is called "We Need to Talk About Prevent." Stop people becoming terrorists. Our strategy for prevent is very simple to say. It's very, very hard to do. First, identify those vulnerable to radicalization and the radicalizers. Second, safeguard those people from being drawn into that terrorist path. And third, manage the risk of radicalizers and extremists who cannot be diverted from terrorism. And that third strand is our unique role. We are law enforcers. I am a cop. I want to safeguard and divert potential terrorists, but if they choose that path, I will stop them through every lawful means at my disposal. It's where prevent becomes pursue. We need to be clear about that, and not being clear about that, where that line is crossed, has caused problems for that prevent policy in the UK. So we need to talk about prevent. My job with MI5 is to stop terrorist attacks. I do protect the most important people in our country, our greatest palaces, including Parliament, the mother of all democracies, and we can have a second conference to debate that statement, and the world's second busiest airport. It's a difficult job. The UK press have taken it to calling it the toughest job in policing, and that's really beginning to annoy my boss. So for the British police officers in the room, there is no doubt whatsoever the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police is by far the hardest job in policing. This, however, may run it a close second. It's a job of enormous privilege, but it demands a great deal of humility. And pursue, protect and prepare strategies, they do prevent terrorism, but they are strategies that can feel very much like a goal line save. And like every crime problem a police officer has ever dealt with, it is impossible to arrest our way out of it. And neither can we turn societies into fortresses just to protect us from every harm. The last 4 years have been the most demanding in counter-terrorism history since the mainland IRA bombing campaigns of the 70s and 90s. And in 2017, our worst year in living memory, I was the deputy to the then head of counter-terrorism, Sir Mark Rowley. And he gave me a very, very long job description, but effectively it boiled down to one thing: stop terrorist attacks in the UK. And yet, on my watch, there were 5 successful attacks. 36 people died, including 2 of our own, and over 500 people were maimed or psychologically damaged, many of them for life. And I think about that every single day, and I say it every time I speak publicly. It has had a very profound physical and mental effect on me. So people do look at me and say, why on earth did you want to be promoted to the top job? Well, it's easy. So I applied for this job to stop 2017 ever happening again. And I think about that responsibility every day too. Stop it happening. If you take one thing away from this speech today, if you want to reduce strategy, all that strategy into 3 words, then stop it happening would be appropriate. And that's why we need to talk about prevent. Many years ago, as a young homicide cop, I was told that there is no greater privilege than to investigate the death of another human being. With nearly 3 decades of experience in policing, I can tell you now that that just isn't true. The greatest privilege has to be to prevent the death of another human being. And we have been successful. We have disrupted 22 lethal attacks since March 2017. 22. I'm very proud of that. We have convicted or disrupted many would-be terrorists. We are very good at pursuit. That's where most of our budget and most of the conversation is. But high levels of extremism mean the threat is greater than it ever was. Pursue can't work on its own, and protect and prepare can't stop every attack. Attacks which are simple to mount, easy to prepare, hard to see, and very hard to stop. So that's why we need to talk about prevent. And the real way to prevent terrorism is to get it right at the start of the radicalization cycle. Prevent is designed to break the cycle of extremist violence by empowering communities and individuals to make them resilient to radicalizers and able to spot the vulnerable in their midst that radicalizers will target and manipulate. It is community, not police or government-led. It is not about the law. It's about stopping people becoming involved with the law. And although I regularly stand up for this policy, mine should be just one of many voices talking about prevent. Police have been seen as securitizing what is designed to be a safeguarding campaign. The government's now appointed Lord Carlisle, our former independent reviewer of terrorist law, to review the prevent strategy in 2020. I say good, because we need to talk about prevent. Carlisle says nothing is off the table, including scrapping it. But I believe he will find strong support for the principle, and he will see amazing work being delivered by people committed to stopping this generational threat. I've spent the last 2 years traveling and talking about 2017, the escalation in threat, pace, and complexity. Better people have talked about it today, and where we as security professionals needed to be better, and that consumed us. My predecessor spoke about 2017 at this very conference. Last year, my deputy was here speaking about protect and prepare. She talked about the sustained shift in threat, the breadth of targets and methodologies, and about our determination to improve. And that's all true. And the UK CT machine continues to get better every single day. But we need to talk about prevent. The challenges of 2019 are as great as we have ever faced. Daesh was defeated militarily, but we are coming to terms with the strength of its brand. We face a new global security challenge that is dispersed and well-networked, one that has no clear physical base or leadership structure, one that is inspired more than it is directed or enabled. And there remains the concern of returning foreign fighters, lone actors, mental illness, and you heard Jay Tabb talk about it compellingly earlier on, the rising threat of right-wing terrorism. Once a local threat, now a global phenomenon, as adept at using social media as Daesh ever was. Christchurch is the most horrific recent example, and 7 of the 22 attacks I've talked about that we stopped in the UK since March 2017 related to right-wing terrorism. We need the whole of society to help spot danger and intervene earlier, remembering the maxim that it's communities, not cops, that defeat terrorism. And those communities need help from other protective services who are unused to dealing with violent ideology, health, education, social care, and they need the help of the private sector. Relentless media coverage of terrorist events is understandable given the public interest, but it may exacerbate the problem. I'm concerned that both social and mainstream media unwittingly amplify the threat. I don't seek to undermine press freedom. They're incredibly important. I get it. But I do want to work with them to understand if their reporting style can help prevent, not promote terrorism. We need to talk about prevent. We don't need to give terrorists the type of notoriety they crave. Crime prevention is at the core of UK policing since Peel invented us in 1829. To maintain order, prevent and detect crime. It's part of our DNA. So remembering that just treating the symptoms of terrorism is not good enough. We must treat the causes. Prevent offers a bespoke programme of support for vulnerable individuals. It is the closest thing to a public health solution that we have. I promote Prevent, but I do acknowledge its issues. To do otherwise would be to ignore opportunities to improve. It would be a failure of leadership. It's on its third iteration in 12 years. It remains as controversial today as it was when it started, and we need to ask ourselves why that is. It isn't the idea. It's in the implementation and communication that we've struggled. We have failed to convince our detractors that we are on the side of the vast majority of the public who want nothing to do with terrorism or its apologists. Of course, some individuals and institutions have more sinister reasons for trying to prevent. Instead of wasting time on those malign detractors, we should concentrate on convincing them who recognise the importance of early intervention, but who have some concerns about why it's so important, about why this programme is so important. Part of the challenge is perception. People pay close attention to fairness in how we conduct business as police officers. They're willing to accept decisions, even one against them, when they perceive a fair process. So we must be transparent and fair in how we select people for Prevent. It is a voluntary programme. You have to want to do this. And ensure compassion and dignity in how we treat them. It's tempting to believe that that in itself is enough, but the challenges are more fundamental than that. Critics are right to challenge perceptions of ambiguity in the programme. There is a lack of understanding about thresholds for intervention and about the limitations of when safeguarding a vulnerable person stops and pursuing criminal behaviour starts. These are issues that I accept, and I'll work with our new independent reviewer and critical friends to address them. But I won't give ground to critics whose agenda is to discredit Prevent to suit their own ends. No one who has challenged Prevent to date has had a better idea. And we must meet these critics with determined honesty. If we concentrate our efforts in certain communities, be they Muslim, white, whatever the community, it is a response to the intelligence contained in over 800 active counter-terrorism investigations in the UK, split between Islamist and right-wing terrorism, and the evidence of the convicted and the disrupted. We'll put Prevent effort where it's needed until the threat picture changes. The focus is an uncomfortable truth in some communities and in some organisations, but I invite them to work with us, not to agitate on the sidelines, and indeed all communities must do the same. Why should everyone care? Because experience tells us that someone always knows or suspects when a person is moving towards an attack. A recent study showed that in the time before most lone actor attacks, someone close to them knew about the growing ideology, knew about the growing violent intent, and mostly they chose not to report it. For Prevent to succeed, those closest to people at risk of being drawn to terrorism need to have confidence that early intervention can divert people away and protect them from suffering or causing harm. Our specialist teams provide a proportionate and compassionate response to every request for help. Put simply, this programme saves and rebuilds lives. It doesn't ruin them. Getting this right is an exercise in trust and confidence between state actors and their communities. That very same study tells another interesting story. The lone actor terrorists share no uniform socio-demographic characteristics. Age, relationship, status, education, employment, mental health, criminal history, they're all factors, but none of them are consistent. And that brings the complexity of this challenge into very sharp focus. There will be no single vaccine to this global disease. We must accept that a number of broad systemic social failings can lead some people, sometimes with complex needs, towards extremist paths. The drivers that cause well-educated, psychologically healthy people to choose extremism and terror are even more difficult for many of us to comprehend. And if your head hurts at this point, please join the club. We need help cutting through this complexity to understand what factors combine to cause terrorism. And policy has to be informed by credible evidence provided by quality academics. So it's excellent that we're here today. For the last 2 years, I've told disturbing stories about successful and aspirational terrorists. This story needed telling to improve how we pursued terrorists. But today, I want to tell a very different story. I want to tell a story about Ali, a 13-year-old boy from Yorkshire. A school social worker noticed Ali drawing Daesh logos on his hands. He wanted to go and fight for Daesh. He's 13 years old. Ali witnessed violence in his home. He suffered racist bullying at school. He had free, unlimited access to violent videos online. Ali started thinking of revenge. Prevent practitioners put support in place for his whole family. It included individual help for both mother and son. Ali received education from an imam who countered Daesh ideology, Pakistani extremist groups, and false Islamic practice. His mother completed a course on internet radicalization and e-safety to help keep her children safe online. And Ali's self-esteem and his confidence began to grow. He renounced extremist views. He became an active member of the local young leaders group, and his mother is now a community volunteer. I want to tell you about Amina. Amina intended to travel to Syria before Prevent found her. Prevent workers helped her rebuild her relationships, reassess her views, and she changed her own mind about traveling. And I want to tell you about Jack, a teenager radicalized by far-right politics at school and rapidly promoted by an extreme right-wing group. Prevent taught Jack to think for himself, and he renounced his blind hatred. He now credits his Prevent mentor with his return to education, his place at college, and his chance to work. I can tell you stories about Liam, about Ryan, about Salim, about Jane, about Owen and Joe. In fact, I can tell you over 400 stories of individuals across England and Wales who in the very same year that we were most attacked got supported through this Prevent programme and the extraordinary people who run it, who gave these people a different choice, who changed their story. And that's why we need to talk about Prevent. I can talk about how we prosecuted terrorists. I can talk about how we intervened, even when we had to kill them before they killed others. But I don't want to talk about that anymore. I want to talk about how we prevented people becoming terrorists in the first place. And then I want society to carry on that conversation and make a difference. If you want to safeguard people from violent ideology, you need a different, more compelling story. We need to help people who see their position in society as hopeless find hope. Help them find a family that believes in society, not a gang that wants to tear society apart. There is no one path to terrorism, I know, and there are a host of common factors that society, not law enforcement, can tackle. The bad stories started with a false sense of victimhood, exclusion, or fear, feelings that lead to resentment, then hatred, and escalate into extremism and violence. It's tragic. It plays out time and time again. But Ali, Amina, and Jack are stories of lives changed, destinations rerouted, and new paths chosen. Each one of these stories carries the possibility of an attack prevented and lives saved, and that possibility is enough for me to reinforce to you that we need to talk about Prevent. Not a single one of these interventions was easy. Intensive and complex needs require intensive and complex resourcing. But it is worth restating that Prevent is my government strategy and not mine. We in policing have a very important and defined role, but it is a small one. And we cannot do this alone. The government, both local and national, leads the charge to step up Prevent services. It's only government leadership that can galvanise a host of different professionals to work together against such a complex challenge. But ultimately, it must be led by society and its communities, not by the government, not by the police, and not by the national security community. Prevent is the most important pillar of my government's contest strategy, but what is Prevent's ultimate goal? Sure, it's to prevent attacks, but I think it's more important than that. We live in a time when divisions seem ever more pronounced. Now, more than ever, we need to unite under a single vision. That's easy to say, but what is it? Is it social inclusion, mobility, education, equality of opportunity? What does success look like? I believe that getting social integration right helps us get closer to that answer. First, Society has to agree what behaviour it is not prepared to tolerate, what line should never be crossed. That's easy for me. I'm a cop. That line is violence. Violence of thought, violence of speech, violence of action is a line that we should never accept, irrespective of culture, religion or belief, however sacredly held. Getting social integration right is like any form of sharing. We know that working in partnership, sharing information, being ready to accept new ways of thinking is healthy, and this applies to organisations, communities and nations. The healthy intermingling of cultures and groups allows for people from different backgrounds to feel part of something bigger, to feel included. Spanish researchers recently used MRI technology to understand what was happening in the brains of people with extremist views. Their experiment found that people who held these views were more likely to be moved to violence when they felt excluded. They concluded that extremist views became heightened and a person's willingness to commit extreme violence to reinforce their view would increase the more excluded they felt. So we knew it instinctively. But now science tells us that effective social integration could help stop extremist violence. The policy recommendation is clear. Communities, institutions, places of worship, schools and businesses must welcome people from all backgrounds, create a sense of belonging, while not forcing people to give up things that they may hold as sacred. Integration does not have to be assimilation. We should build communities that are inclusive, and if we fail to share, fail to include, and fail to support, then we risk social exclusion turning to violence. And when we identify those approaching that line of violence, the best answer is sometimes not to ostracize or to criminalize, but to support with understanding and compassion. And we have to focus on what unites us: respect, decency, family, love, to find common ground we can all support. And I believe Prevent in the UK is the search for that common ground. I have been called ridiculously idealistic. But I believe more than ever that evil triumphs when good people do nothing. In the UK, the Prevent programme is full of exceptional people who get up every day to do something to stop the world's greatest evil, terrorism. I salute them. We should all salute them. They are incredibly brave people. So, I needed to talk about Prevent, but now I need you to do the same. Or our children's children's children will be coming here at the 90th ICT conference and talking about the same things we've heard today. Thank you for listening.